This week in Colorado history, we're going to take a look at minorities in Colorado. We're going to look at them historically, and then we're going to take them up to present day. In your textbook, the focus is on the civil rights movement. It gives you a little bit of background history of what happened in Colorado. And it then jumps pretty quickly into the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a big galvanizer for many people in Colorado, ethnic minorities as well as other minority populations. It was initially started in the late 50s and 60s by the African American population in the United States. It was a drive by the people to have their rights protected, rights like the right to vote, the right to free speech, which were being infringed upon by people during the time. These are rights protected and given by the Constitution, and under the Equal Protection Clause, people have the right to basically sue other people if those rights are aggrieved. And so basically what happened was a lot of people got together during that time, were upset about having their rights infringed upon, and a lot of groups formed at this time to have their rights protected. So you can see on the right side it says, what are civil rights? Well, they are enforceable rights such as the freedom of speech, the right to vote, which if they're interfered by other people with, they give rise to action for injury. And this is what really happened during this time period, is that people started to recognize that their rights were being infringed upon. And it allowed people within ethnic minority populations as well as other populations to come together and fight for their rights. We're going to look first at African American people in Colorado. We're going to look historically at what happened in Colorado, and then we're going to move closer to present day. You can see that I have three pictures here. The first one is of Deerfield. The second one is of Five Points, which is a place in Colorado that I'm going to talk more about. And then the last picture is of a woman. Her name is Justina Ford. I want to give a little bit of perspective because I think what is interesting, especially about Western history, is that the West was really an opportunity for a lot of minority populations. It was a place for them to come, to work, to potentially own land, to work that land. And so I think when we look at the West, there is perhaps a little bit different history than that of the East, where we have slavery and ideas like that. The West was a place where people, as I mentioned before, were allowed to come and seek opportunity. While the story isn't quite as easy as I kind of lay it out there, I think that it is important to reflect upon what sort of opportunities were available for minorities in Colorado. So Deerfield, as we know, was an agricultural community that was started by African Americans. It was successful for a time period, and eventually, unfortunately, like we know, a lot of agricultural communities just disappeared. And that was because of a lot of things. It was because of the soil. It was because of the location that they chose, the water. There are a whole lot of factors that influenced the success or non-success of Deerfield. Justina Ford is a representation of many African American people who came to Colorado. She was a woman who came, as you can see, between the years of 1870 and 1852. She came in about the 1900s. She was eventually a pediatrician, and she was very successful here in Colorado. She got her start here and did quite well in Colorado. Now let's take a look at Five Points. Five Points is an area in Denver today, and it got started in the 1880s. It was started as a residential location for upper and middle class white professionals. It was a stop basically along the cable car route, and became eventually quite attractive to African American professionals who started to also move into the neighborhood. Between about the years 1911 and 1922, there were some new homes built in the area which enticed a lot more people to come in. The new homes had electricity, plumbing. They were some of the best homes in Denver at that time period. What happened then to bring a larger influx of African American people into the area was that streetcars further connected Five Points to other African American neighborhoods along Broadway. And if you look back in the map, you can see Broadway is one of the streets that is on the periphery of Five Points neighborhood. So this brought more people into the community. Five Points for that period of time was a focal point for the African American community and is known today as one of the most prosperous communities in the West. Like I mentioned before, it was for the most part very influential African American people who settled there, and eventually it would become home to a huge arts community and would entice a lot of jazz musicians to come in. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it, as you can see here, housed 50 bars and clubs within this tiny area. We saw the likes of Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, some of the great jazz musicians come in and out in Denver and play in those clubs. But the reality, and something that we just have to kind of think about, is that when those jazz musicians came in, they were not allowed to stay any place other than 5 Points. They weren't allowed to stay in other Denver neighborhoods because of their race. So while there was a lot of prosperity, there was also discrimination because of people's race. You also see another example of discrimination in your textbook, the story about what happens in Washington Park. Washington Park had a little pool where people could swim. Well, people based on their race, so African American people, were not allowed to swim in the same swimming area as the white people. I would encourage you to read a little bit more about that. So as you can see, while people were successful within Colorado, within Denver, there were still some hurdles for people to overcome. So post-war, what happens, and this is where we get to the civil rights movement. People are basically awoken to those rights and come back from the war saying, you know, I fought for my country. Why is it that I can't have the same rights as other people? So in 1961, African American people in Colorado, Denver specifically, formed the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE. And what they fought for was equal opportunity in jobs, housing, and education. They also wanted equal treatment by law enforcement officers and the legal system. While they made some gains, there was still a lot to be done. But what happened in the 1970s after this insurgence of people trying to fight for their rights, people start to leave the 5 Points area in the 1970s, sort of fleeing from that racial area, trying to go into the suburbs, trying to go into different communities. What happens in 5 Points at that time period is that it's unfortunately kind of a downfall of 5 Points. Businesses start to close, the crime and violence starts to rise within the 5 Points area, and homes start to deteriorate because we have those populations moving out of the 5 Points area. So for a period of time, and I look for statistics, and I would encourage you, if you are interested, to go on to the Denver City Police website, because it does give some statistics for the 5 Points area. Crime was pretty rampant within the area. We saw a lot of gangs. We saw a pretty terrible area for a time period. Today, however, if you do a search for 5 Points, what you'll find is a very different story. It is one of the areas that is targeted by the city of Denver for redevelopment. A lot of things are happening within the areas. It's becoming a very vibrant community. The light rail has connected it. It's close to downtown. Many people are choosing to move within that area today. and it's taking on a whole different flair. You have museums which really celebrate the area, a dance ensemble, so arts and culture is prolific within the area. However, what is really interesting, I think, is that it's got a very different ethnic makeup. By and large, within that area now you see about 50% of the population is Hispanic. So it takes on a different flair, a different story, but it is, by and large, I would say, made up of ethnic minorities. But what is most exciting, I think, is that it is the center of urban redevelopment today. I'm going to talk only briefly here about the Mexican American population, and you will be responsible for this information through the film that is posted under this week, as well as the lecture that is written out. So the Mexican American population, as the American Indian population that we'll talk about later, was a traditional population here in Colorado. So when we think about this population, we need to think about the residents that were already here, as well as the residents that came in. So those residents that were already here, as we know, settled in southern Colorado. We see the population that is vibrant and that's been here for a very long time. But then we see in about the 1910s a new population starting to arrive in Colorado. And these are immigrants who are coming in from Mexico. The sugar beet industry actually tries to entice a lot of immigrant workers up to Colorado to work in the sugar beet fields. And what we see then in the 1910s is a new population coming into Colorado. And that's where you're going to start to look at the film and try to understand what that looked like in the early 1910s. We also see the civil rights movement being taken hold of by this population as well. Corky Gonzalez takes the lead on this and starts something called the Crusade for Justice. So as I mentioned, it's going to be up to you to kind of formulate the same sort of picture that I've given you for the African American community and that I'll give you for the American Indian community. Thinking about kind of the history, what brings them up to the civil rights movement, and really where they are right now as a population in terms of their rights. I'm going to do a part 2 of this PowerPoint, and that's going to cover the American Indian population.